Before we get going, I just want to highlight two things for you, or three things actually. The first thing is that our bathrooms are, if you go to the steps that you came up, you have to go the down steps and you go straight ahead. Guys' bathroom is the door on the right, ladies' bathroom is the door on the left, if you need that. If you need a drink, there's a water fountain in the gym. Again, down the steps, to the left, through the doors, you'll see a water fountain there. The second item, please turn off your cell phones. That is much, much appreciated. Rod will not be taking any phone calls for the next hour or so. So you think you're off? Yeah, mine is, I'll turn it off at the back. So if you could do that, please, thank you very much. And then thirdly, before I hand it off to Dave, who will introduce Rod and start off with a prayer, I'll just let you know that we're also open at Bethany 9 o'clock on Sunday mornings. Feel free to drop in anytime. Not this Sunday. Okay, 2 Sundays. There we go. Service is at 10. We're open before that.
Thanks, Herb. Shall we bow for a word of prayer? Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to bring Rod into our midst and enjoy all the history that he has given us. We thank you for science, the noblest of all tools, so we can do your work. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. In 1968, my grandfather came to me, who was quite a well-known Sunday school teacher. He was well-read, and he said, God will never allow man to walk on the moon. He died February 25th, 1969, and July the 20th, 1969, Aldrin and Armstrong, they did it. And when Apollo 11 was on its way to the moon, I had another uncle that was a high school teacher, and he came to me, he's paranoid, they're not going to make it. So, there's a lot of different things that happened in the 1960s. And this was certainly one of the most exciting adventures of all humankind. And Neil Armstrong, when he returned, he was quiet, didn't say too much. It took him a few years before he started to talk about his experiences. And he said, I was a test pilot, and then I was a fighter pilot, and I saw firsthand the devastation in Korea of modern weapons. He didn't like war. And he got involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Somebody once told me that wasn't such a big deal. But I spoke to a retired sailor in the 1980s, and he was on a ship in the Mediterranean. And he was told, they were all told that we're going on a one-way trip to Turkey, and you're not going home. And the ship was loaded with thermonuclear weapons. After the Cuban Missile Crisis subsided, Neil Armstrong said the tension between the Soviet Union and the Americans was so high. They both had their fingers on the nuclear trigger, ready to go at it at any moment's notice. So what happened? What took that pressure off? A few words. We're going to the moon. Not because it's easy, because it's hard. Kennedy, as soon as he said that, that was it. Both had the space race involved in the space race. And Armstrong said this prevented World War III. So when you look at it from that context, who won the space race? Well, we all did. The second thing the space race did was supercharge our economy. There's been said that 1964 was the finest year in American history. NASA some months was getting over 4,000 patents a month, and they were using that as a science driver in agriculture, manufacturing, transportation systems. The Soviet people and the Germans, they came and visited America. They couldn't believe the economy, how it exploded. And the whole country backed the space program. Now, Rod was involved in Apollo 13. It was a disaster. They didn't make it to the moon, but some people have said this is the finest hour that NASA ever had. And he was involved with 7 people, and he told me that there's 2 that are left, and Rod happens to be one of them. I could go on and on. We could all go on and on about what we know about the space program, but he has something very, very special to talk to us about. So I've taken enough time. I'm going to hand the mic over to Rod and let him give his presentation. But I want you to pay attention to what he says, but also his tone and inflection. Because at that time, these guys had scientific optimism. They could do anything, and you'll notice it in his demeanor. He hasn't lost that. I got part of that because I was 10, 11, 12 years old when the space program was on. But the scientific optimism that they had was real because they based it on mathematics and physics and chemistry and biology and all that. And there was just under 400,000 people that worked on the space program to make it happen. And we're here today to celebrate one of Rod's achievements with his team. And believe me, when you want to watch Apollo 13, watch the movie, but watch Netflix too. It'll give you the details on how dangerous these things had. This was just a pattern for failure, one after another, after another. And the entire planet, for a number of days, were together. The communists were on our side. Let's get these guys home safely. Everybody was unified to get these guys home. Rod, you're on.
Thank you. I guess that'll sit there all right. Probably not. Maybe I should put it down below. Thank you, David, for those kind words. There it is. Finally, an engineer makes it work. Crazy. I thank all of you for coming, especially on a warm summer evening when you could be doing many other things. I feel standing in this beautiful church, I should be giving a sermon, but I'm not qualified for that. However, I think I am qualified to talk about this particular Canadian story that involved a group of science engineers at the University of Toronto Aerospace Institute. And just a bit about my background. I got a PhD in aerospace engineering, and then I was director of the Aerospace Institute for about 10 years. They finally got rid of me and put me out downtown on the main campus to help the president raise research money. And then I got involved in a variety of projects. Now, this particular story is a Canadian story, and you don't see it or hear about it in the Apollo 13 movie. But we have evidence the importance that this group played in the Apollo program when Fred Hayes, the lunar excursion module pilot, actually came up to our institute and gave us all Space Pioneer medals, which was very welcome. Slightly late, 20 years late, but anyway, it takes them a long time to recognize maybe these guys have a point. Next slide. This started in April of 1970. Houston, we have a problem, is the famous words that we've heard from, I guess it was Lovell. And I'd like to point out, just as background for a lot of people that aren't really knowledgeable about the Apollo spacecraft, there are three essential elements to it. One is the lunar module with the legs on it. This is the command module, and it's attached to the service module. The service module provides all the power, oxygen, etc., for the astronauts in this module. So, next slide, please. The largest rocket that existed up until a few years ago was the Saturn V, and the modules are located at the tip of the rocket. You can see that this rocket was so high, it's equivalent to a 36-story building. But Elon Musk has outdone this with his Skybird rocket, which is now almost 400 feet long, and it's had a couple of successful flights. This thing produces tremendous thrust, all through using hydrogen mixed with oxygen and a bit of oxygen and kerosene. They're two different stages of fuel to burn to lift this small module up into space. Next slide. This is it in more detail. The lunar module that ends up being the life support system for the astronauts. Again, the attachment to the command module. And then this is the service module. Now, you have to understand the kind of velocities that are involved here. You orbit the Earth at about 17,000 miles an hour. En route to the moon, it slows down a bit because of gravity. But to escape the Earth's gravity, you have to hit a velocity, circular velocity, to go out on a tangent at about 24,000 miles an hour. Now, to put that into perspective, if you closed your eyes and opened them 14 seconds later, at that speed, you'd be in Toronto. Now, not many of you want to go there, but that's how fast you're traveling. Next slide. This is a launch, a typical launch. I've been to several with the Canadian Space Program. And the one thing you notice when you're in the stands, that when the engines kick in, the water starts rumbling and getting very frothy, and the fish do crazy things. And it's very impressive to see this go up and follow it through into the atmosphere. Now, on April 13th, this launch happened, and the purpose was, of course, to land 2 astronauts on the moon. And prior to that, they had Apollo 11 and Apollo 12, and they were quite successful. Next slide, please. Now, what happened? Well, to ensure that the oxygen in the tanks that were in the service module were stirred and wouldn't layer out because they had sensors monitoring the oxygen. And why did they need oxygen? The astronauts were living in the command module at a pressure of 5 pounds per square inch, which is quite low. Ambient pressure here is about 14.7 to put it into perspective. And one of the reasons the pressure is so low is because the command module is very thin skin structure. It's made out of aluminum plates sandwiched between honeycomb, aluminum honeycomb. And honeycomb is the same kind of geometric configuration you would see in a bee's hive. Now that honeycomb is filled with a phenolic resin. Just think of it as like a very high temperature polymer. It cures, and it has a melting point of maybe 350 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't talk in centigrade and that. I'm of the old school. I'm still Fahrenheit, miles, and inches. That's the way I think. So you've got this sandwich structure, and it's quite thin. It's only 1.5 inches, maybe 2 inches at the base to house these astronauts in an oxygen environment, which is very explosive at 5 psi. They can live at that. Now, the reason I mention that is that part of the command module can only sustain the temperature of about 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit before it melts. On top of the curved face of the command module is about a 3-inch layer of ablative material like carbon mixed with phenolic resins, and they don't melt. They're not like a thermoplastic that you see in toys that will melt. This kind of material chars, ablates, and as it chars under high temperature, it keeps the substrate cool Because if that re-entry temperature that you're going to see later ever gets angled around on the command module, that command module can only take up to 1,000 degrees and it melts and the astronauts will be gone. So we then have to figure out, well, what happened to this? Why did this mission fail so badly? And it's all got to do with the oxygen tanks. As I mentioned, they need the oxygen in the service module to provide oxygen for breathing, but it also powers fuel cells. And that whole service module provides power, oxygen, all the controls. It provides the whole life support system for the 3 astronauts that are sitting in the command module. Now, here's a great example in engineering where the common phrase, "the devil is in the details," can kill you. That's exactly what happened here. We're talking about a $350 million spacecraft, and for the cost of a couple of $100, the thermostat controls that were in the oxygen tanks, once the astronauts were given the okay to turn on the mixing system to stir the oxygen up in the tank so it doesn't layer. And the reason they want to do that is they have sensors that are monitoring what's going on in the spacecraft and how much oxygen you have left. Well, there are thermostat switches in that tank, and the supplier didn't get the memo. NASA changed the voltage, I think from 28 to 65 volts. Everyone else got the memo but the supplier. So he supplied the original old thermostats, and they melted. And as they melted, the wiring harness started to melt because the temperature was rising. And around 1,000 degrees, the oxygen tank exploded and took out the other oxygen tank. Fred Hayes, the lunar pilot, he thought a meteorite had hit the ship, but that wasn't the case. These tanks had exploded and blew off the whole side of the service module. It basically says all that up here. I just like to talk about it. I don't need to read it. Next slide, please. Here you can see a photo that was taken by the astronauts of the service module and the whole side panel that was blown away. So this happened when the spaceship was about 200,000 miles from Earth. To reach the moon is about 239,000 miles, so they're very close to the moon. Fortunately, the moon's gravity at that point was strong enough to control the motion of the spacecraft. That was critical because they used the gravity of the moon to swing the spacecraft around the moon to bring it back. That's what happened with Artemis too, only they went a little further out and came back. So all the services and power were shut off in the command module. So you got 3 astronauts there, and fortunately, they were smart enough to realize that they could go and live temporarily in the lunar module. But the lunar module is only designed for 2 astronauts because normally the lunar module would separate once they're in orbit around the moon, and it would fly down and land on the moon, and there'd be 2 astronauts in it. One the pilot, and the other, I guess, an investigator, scientist, I guess. Anyway, now they're in a real dilemma. They have to rig up, as you heard, maybe some of you have seen Apollo 13, but they went to great effort to try and handle the carbon dioxide problem and rigged up a device for that. They had oxygen available from tanks in the lunar module. The temperature was cold. Fred Hayes actually got sick on the way back. He couldn't take that cold. And so they had to alternate, 2 at a time there, 1 in the command module and exchange. They lost all their guidance and control system, so they were shooting, trying to figure out from stars and sun and the moon the right trajectory. In fact, the initial trajectory that they picked would have missed the Earth by 2,500 miles, but they had some reaction control jets that they could fix it up based on data from Houston. So now the problem is that they have to try and figure out what they're going to do when it comes time to land back on Earth. Now, the lunar module was never ever designed to land on Earth and follow the command module. The command module is the one that has the ablative protection. If without that ablative protection at the front face, they would simply burn up. Now, one of the issues is you've got to find the correct angle to come in. The right angle is about 6 degrees from the horizontal. If you're too low, like 3 degrees, you'll skip out in the atmosphere, just like a stone on the water when you flick it. If you come in too steep, say 7, 8, well not 7, but maybe 8 or 9 degrees, then the temperature buildup is so high, the G-loading is so high, you would probably burn up, because the ablative material is only designed for about 1,000 seconds of high temperature flight. Okay, so this is a precarious mission. These guys are in deep trouble. Next slide, please. Well, I've actually covered this. So the trick was then to try and see at what point the lunar module could be separated from the command module, and how would you do that? Here's a photo of Fred Hayes, the lunar module pilot, coming up through a tunnel. This tunnel is critical. There's 2 sections of a tunnel, about 30 inches wide, on the command module and on the lunar module. And the purpose of that tunnel, which is only about 30, 40 inches long, I think, they bolt them together. And the purpose was to allow the astronauts to be able to get into the lunar module for their eventual flight to the moon, or in this case, as a safety place, a life preserve area. So this tunnel is actually controlled by 2 hatches, a hatch on the lunar module and a hatch on the command module. These hatches are critical because if they don't seal properly and they leak, then they won't survive re-entry on the command module. And of course, it's critical if the lunar module was headed for the moon, then of course that seal is important because of the vacuum. So, next slide, please. Here we have the lunar excursion module. The heat shield was actually, that translates into about 5,000 degrees, 2,700 Fahrenheit, yeah. Okay, so anyway, this lunar excursion module is intended to, as I said, land on the moon. And the problem was how to separate that. Next slide. Okay, here's what happened. The astronauts were scheduled to land on the Friday the 17th. On the 16th in the morning, we got a phone call at the Institute. It didn't come to me. I was a junior associate professor at the time. It came to one of my colleagues, Dr. Barry French, and it came from NASA Houston, and it was the guy who was in control of the lunar module. He was with Grumman, and Grumman Aerospace built the lunar module. So he called the Institute and asked Barry French to see if they could come up with a mechanism to separate the lunar module from the command module prior to re-entry. He said that we needed to come up with an answer by 4 o'clock that afternoon. And we just, yes?
One question, so why couldn't they just use the normal way of separating? The actual way that it would have separated when they were circling the moon, why couldn't they use that methodology?
The problem was the pressure for separation had to be very different because of the angle that the command module would have for re-entry. It had to be precise, so you couldn't use the full pressure to separate it because normally in the lunar configuration, the command module would be circling the moon, they would separate, and then the lunar module had its own reaction control jets, and it could descend to the Earth. The problem was because of the angles of re-entry. That heat shield had to be lined up around 6 degrees. So we were asked to come up with an answer, and the trick was to use that tunnel and fill it with oxygen. In this case, it'd be 5 psi, the same as in the command module. Seal the hatch, and then blow the lunar module away. But the trick was, what pressure could you use? They knew that 5 psi, if you did that, would have damaged the hatch. The other thing was that the hatch on the command module had problems with the seal. So they had had problems before making sure that seal was closed tight. So our guys worked on this from about 9:30 in the morning till about 4 in the afternoon. We were working on the assumption that NASA had contacted other very great aerospace centers, Caltech, MIT, Georgia Tech. They had NASA bases they could contact. But the time frame is critical because they wanted the answer by 4 o'clock, 4:30 that night to relay to the astronauts so that they could set the system up and then re-enter. So, next slide, please. We had a team. As I said, Barry French was the senior guy. That's him right there. Ben Etkin is a specialist in aerodynamics. Barry is a specialist in rarefied gases. Irv Glass, a very famous professor in shock waves. This guy here is Phil Sullivan, a fluid mechanics guy. And this guy hiding off in the corner is me. And I'm not an expert in any of these areas. As I said, my expertise is in structures and materials. And the reason Barry wanted me there was because once they calculated a pressure to separate the lunar module, we had to look at the load that would put on the seal. Next slide, please. This is a shot of the guys working on the problem. Now, I'd like to emphasize, especially to the younger people here, that in those days we didn't have calculators. We did not have computers. We did not have software packages. This was all done by hand and with a slide rule. And of course, the young guy's saying, what the heck's a slide rule? Well, some of the older guys here will know what a slide rule is. But a slide rule is 3 component, a stick, if you will. Mine was plastic. It's clamped at both ends. The interior bar slides between the inner and outer bars, so it moves along this way. And there's a cursor on it. So you move the cursor along to the number you want, and you move the stick along to the number you want, and you get an answer. The trouble was, in those days, the best we could do might be 1 decimal point accuracy. And we're trying to get these guys to come down at 6-degree re-entry angle. So the slide rule, it was a critical tool for engineers for right up, well, past the 70s. And it had logarithm functions, all the trigonometric functions on it, plus all the regular numbers arithmetic. So for example, if I moved the stick to number 2, and I took the cursor and moved it to the other place where it said number 2, the answer below should be 5. I'm kidding, it's 4. Well, I said it was only good to a decimal point. Anyway, that's what we had to work with. And we weren't the only ones. I mean, all the other engineers everywhere were using the same technology. No calculators, software programs to solve this problem. Now, you may have wondered what my job was, this crazy guy just leaning on the shelf, on the desk. And my job really was to absorb what these guys were calculating so that I could take that pressure back to the office and calculate the loads on the aluminum laminate. It was actually, the hatch area was a reinforced aluminum structure. And in those days, we had good textbooks. Timoshenko comes to mind for any of you that may have been in engineering. And so I used that to estimate what the deformation of that cap may be. The reasoning being that we were concerned about the seal. Any significant deformation from that burst pressure load might cause that seal to break or open up a bit. And it would cause the loss of the astronauts. Next slide, please. Well, what happened was we came up with a number of 2 psi. So recall that the spacecraft was already pre-pressured to 5 pounds per square inch. So you bleed the air out of the tunnel area down to 2 psi. You close the hatch. You then let the bolt section that bolts the lunar module to the command module, you explosively set off those bolts, and then you get this pressure pulse because you're going into vacuum of space. And so that pressure drives the lunar module, which was heavier than the command module. And the idea was not to drive it so far that it would tumble in with your command module. You don't want it tumbling behind you. But you don't want the pressure to be so high that it disturbs the re-entry angle of the command module. You got to try and preserve that around 6 degrees, 6.5, because of the thermal shield. It was only good for 1,000 seconds before it was gone. So we all went home, and we felt pretty good about what we'd done. But the assumption was, of course, that NASA's going to take a variety of answers they get from different institutes and I would have taken an average and said, well, that's it, boys. And you'll see in the movie, I think, that the command center relays up to the astronauts 2 psi. And that's what we had predicted. And it turns out later in a post-flight interview that the astronauts actually set it to about 2.5. They wanted to be sure that that lunar module would separate and be gone. They weren't that concerned, I guess, about the re-entry angle, but that was critical. So anyway, it turns out Friday, April 17th, they landed, and when this command module starts its re-entry, at around 100,000 feet or so, the atmospheric pressure is starting to build up. And as it gets to around 25,000 feet or more, the temperature is really growing hot on that heat shield. And as I mentioned before, it chars, just burns away and cools the substrate behind you. Then the parachutes deploy, and eventually these guys landed safely on Friday in the Pacific Ocean. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the recovery of Apollo 13. There's nothing much left of the ablation shield. You can see a lot of scar tissue on the sides, but fortunately this aluminum structure held, and the astronauts survived. Next picture. Here they are. We got Fred Hayes, that's Schweigert, and that's the Jim Lovell. He was the commander. So they survived. They were happy. We were happy. We got into work the next day and we said, wow, that's great. And we went about our business. Next, this is a post-flight review, and that's when we heard that they had actually set the pressure at about 2.5 psi. Next slide. This is the module, and I mentioned at 25,000 miles an hour, you can imagine how fast that is if you just think of being in Toronto in 14 seconds. The next slide. Okay, here's the crux of the story. Yeah, Canadians, scientists, we put together a number, but we just assumed that we're just one of many. We got a notice the next 2 days later. We were the only people that Grumman and NASA called. They didn't call any other group in Caltech or NASA Langley. They only called us. And when I first heard that, I said, I don't believe it. They're just being nice, these poor Canadians, you know. So we finally got written statement from the head guy that had called us to do the calculation. And he said that your estimates were the main quantitative criterion for confidence in the procedure. The astronauts were instructed to vent the tunnel between 2 and 2.5, and ours was the only guide for determining how close to collapse the case had been. Richard Oman, head, in charge of the lunar module design. So we didn't really believe it, but then when we got a letter that said the same thing, and then when we heard from Fred Hayes that they were going to give us medals, we finally believed it. So the real question is, why did they just call us? Who the heck were we? Bunch of Canadian scientists at a well-renowned institute. Our institute was rated number 5 in North America for aerospace research, so that's pretty good. And then we began to ponder why they did this. Well, first of all, Dr. Ullman, he knew and had met and worked with Barry French. And Barry had him up at one time, and Dr. Ullman had seen the diverse set of expertise that existed at our institute that you don't generally find at any other institute. Our director at the time made sure he hired people that were specialists in a specific discipline. So we had gas dynamics guys, shock wave guys, rarefied gas guys, a structures guy, and many others that contributed. So we figured that was part of the reason, but there was another reason that came up more recently, and that was they were running out of time. They didn't have time at Thursday morning to go to other institutes and ask them to do a calculation, even if they thought about it. But this particular guy decided that the aerospace guys were the guys that could do it, and it looks like we did it. So we felt that we got cheated on the Apollo 13 movie. I think they should have said, oh, a bunch of Canadians also helped out, you know? And so, is there another slide? Yeah, this is Fred Hayes, and this is what he wrote about us. And so I think that I feel obligated to try and promote the Canadian aspect to this story because the Apollo 13 story is well known, mainly because of the film that was produced. But Canada often does not get the recognition for the talent and the accomplishments that we have made in a variety of areas. So rather than let this story just die on the vine, I occasionally like to give a short talk on what this is all about and promote the creativity of our Canadian scientists. So I thank you very much for coming and for taking the time to listen to this short story, and I'll be pleased to answer any questions you have.
If you don't mind, I'd like to go back to the question that another gentleman asked partway through. So, on the return trip from the moon, they have to jettison the lunar module at some point, and
Right.
I can't remember typically when that gets done. Does it get done before they leave lunar orbit?
No, yeah, what happens is on the designers of the lunar module, this is a factoid, actually put more than the 8 prescribed reaction jets on it. They put 16, I was told. The procedure is, as you're orbiting the moon, you explosively separate the bolts, you pump out the air. They never have done a pressure push on it before. They make it vacuum. Then the lunar pilot generates a very soft path away into a slightly different orbit using the control jets. The reason being they don't want to disturb the orbit of the lunar command or the command module, because again, if they do that, they could end up re-entering but the lunar atmosphere. So it's a soft departure.
So basically, it's a totally different process.
Yes,
That's the whole
they
thing.
had never, as far as we know, NASA had never done a pressure pulse release before.
Okay.
So this was all new. And that's why the pressure was so important, because someone had done a calculation and said, well, you can't release it at 5 psi, which is the pressure in the module, because it would damage the structure. You're talking about about maybe 700-800 pounds of load on that hatch. It's only about 30 inches in diameter. So they had never done that before. So this was new. But it was the only only way that anyone could think of doing it, the separation. If they had put them, I'll tell you what, if one of the astronauts wanted to die, he could have gone into that lunar module, did a soft separation, and off he'd fly into space. But that was not in the cards.
So it's interesting because in the movie they dwelled so much on how they figured out how to use square canisters, CO2 canisters in the lunar module, and
right.
they spent an awful lot of time focusing on how they figured out how to power up the command module after it had been shut down and frozen.
It had been shut down.
Yeah. But they really didn't make a mention at all of the procedure that you folks worked out, and clearly it was easily as important as either of those other two procedures.
Yes. Yeah, we think it was.
Yeah.
The wrong.
I get it.
You know, if our guys had said 4 psi, I think that would have been disastrous in hindsight, because it's mainly because that re-entry angle is so critical. If you've only got enough insulation on the command module for about 1,000 seconds at that high temperature, you can't afford to come in too steep or like a pebble on the water. If you come in, or you say, well, we'll make it 3 degrees, just cruise in slow, you'd skip the atmosphere at a certain altitude, and you probably off you go.
And in fact, I mean, if the movie's accurate, their angle of entry was actually a little bit off because they remained in blackout for 4 minutes instead of the typical 3 minutes, right?
Right. It's usually 1,000 seconds is probably what, about 5 minutes, 4 or 5 minutes, about 60 seconds, yeah.
Yeah, so they were cutting it close all the way.
Oh, they were, yeah. And so I think our guys, most of them are gone now, deserve a lot of credit for what they did. But the funny thing is going home. You know, you go home and talk to the family. What did you do today? Oh, we did a calculation to help NASA, but, you know, we're just one of many. You go in the next day, you say, hey, guys, they got home. Oh, great. What are we doing now? So I'm glad they never told us. If that Dr. Ullman had said, oh, by the way, we want an answer by 4:30, and you're the only guys doing it, that would have been a disaster. Our guys would still be at the blackboard today. Do we do this? Do we do that? Steve.
Engineers don't like to be wrong.
Yeah.
I'm not sure of my dates. I'm just curious when the Arrow was canceled in Canada.
Yeah,
And I'm wondering, many ended up in the United States,
they did.
but did some end up at the U of T?
No.
They didn't at
No,
all.
those guys from the Avro program, most of them were hired by NASA. In fact, it's the Canadian group that left the Arrow program that's basically the foundation for the space program. Never mind von Braun and his group of guys. Yes. That's an earlier era. But for the modern era of space travel, the Canadians from the Avro program went down.
We weren't able to take advantage of that knowledge in Canada at that time.
No. It's another one of Canadian mistakes by politicians. They should never have canceled that Arrow. It was the best fighter bomber in the world at that time.
Is there anybody here that worked for the Avro company? There's a guy by the name of Owen Maynard, lived in Kitchener-Waterloo, and he was one of the top Avro Aero. I spoke to this guy for about 50 minutes in 1999 in July, at the 30th anniversary of the moon landing mission. And he was the guy that originally designed the LEM, and then an American engineer took over and detailed it more, but he was the person that made the LEM what it was originally. So we got a little bit of claim to fame there too. But I mean, there's so much we can talk about the space program. Another question? Ted.
Yeah, I happened to watch the Apollo 13 movie about a month ago on a rainy spring afternoon, a riveting movie.
Yes,
but
it
I'm
is.
kind of interested in, from the personal side, how many of the 3 astronauts are still alive?
I think Fred Hayes is.
And what would be his...
Jim
what's
Lovell
he
just
doing
died
with them?
a while back, and I don't know about Jack Schweigert. but I know Fred came up a while back, and I think he's still alive.
So he's still living a fairly healthy life?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Yeah, I just wonder, like, how do you get back to normalcy after you come back from a trip like that?
A lot of them didn't. A lot of the astronauts didn't. There were 12 astronauts that have landed on the moon, and a lot of them have quite different personalities now. And all you have to do is listen to the 3 that went around in Artemis, how the effect, the emotional and psychological effect it's had on them, seeing Earth in such a far distance and realizing there's a lot more out there than we know of. And the UFO program's a good one.
Thank you. By the way, thank you very much for explaining it in layman's language. If I was able to understand it, you did a great job of explaining it.
Thank you.
Another little note, when Buzz Aldrin was sitting on the moon, he had communion on the moon.
He did.
And then Rod said he left the Bible on the moon.
Yes.
And he returned the chalice that he used to have communion on the moon, and it's at his church in Arizona, and it is said that every year around July 20th, they bring that chalice out and have communion.
Yes. Yeah. That's amazing.
You mentioned that the explosion that would separate the two structures
Yeah, the pressure pulse. Yeah.
may change the angle of attack of the craft. Did they not have something? Were there not jets? Could they not adjust that angle of attack as they came in after this separation?
They may have still had access to 1 or 2 reaction control jets on the command module, because they did do a mid-course correction on the way back to Earth. I mentioned earlier they were originally scheduled to miss the Earth by 2,500 miles, just off into space. And so they did a course correction, so they may have had enough fuel in those reaction jets to line this module up. But the big problem was, it's like a two-body problem with a pulse, an impulse. So it's an action and reaction. So it pushes one thing this way and it pushes this one. And the command module is much lighter than the lunar module. So that was another issue. You hit that with 4 or 5 psi, and you're going to send it down into a deep re-entry path.
And they didn't have the fuel to bring it back.
No.
That was the problem.
No.
Thank you.
No more comments? Rod, anything you would like to say in closing?
I think the space program is a fantastic program for Canada. I've always been involved in the space program, and I flew experiments on the space shuttle, and I've flown experiments on satellites, and I've worked with the Russians, who actually stole one of my experiments. And they told me it had crashed in the sea, and it hadn't. But other than that, I think it's a great opportunity to bring various countries together as we are. Russians are still going up with Americans, so I think it's a unifier. And I think the people that get into it are usually dedicated, and I think that my time has passed, but the young people, like this young lad sitting here, he's the future, I think. And so I'm all for supporting them as much as I can.
It's the science, and the science is a tool that we've been given that we can accomplish a lot. Rod, you know, you and I had lunch a while ago, and you kind of held me spellbound for an hour and a half, just like you did here tonight. And I want to really thank you for taking the time to come here and share your thoughts. You know, the 1960s sure were an exciting time. It'd be nice to bring back some of those times and have some huge projects, and like you say, join the whole world in a common project to go and explore.
Yeah.
because it does unify
Yeah.
the whole world when you start setting aside some of your differences and you work together for this common goal. The Americans, when they put man on the moon, they had people from all different countries. Some like Canada, we did the Canada reactor. People from all over the world helped us. The people in the Manhattan Project, 130,000 people that worked on that project. They said it was going to take 50 years to do it. They did it in 4, but it wasn't just Americans. They took people from Canada, from all over the world to do these projects. And now we have these isotopes coming in from the nuclear energy industry. So, you know, the science is something that I have a passion for.
Yes, I know that.
And Rod, we'd just like to thank everyone for coming out this evening, too.
Thank you, folks.